Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Welcome to this edition of Michael Brown Unplugged. I'm glad to have you with me. So yesterday was one of those days that the news just kept breaking all afternoon. And I was really tempted to do a special episode of the podcast last night, but because the news was breaking so fast and furious and there was so much going on that I thought, let's just wait and let's just stick to the regular schedule. But I want to get to, and I know that you have probably already heard that Bob Mueller held a press conference yesterday at the Department of Justice. Now, why he felt compelled to do this particular press conference, I don't really know. He has claimed all along, and he reiterated that yesterday in the press conference, that he was not going to appear before Congress, and that whatever questions Congress might have, those questions are answered by a simple reading of the special counsel's report, also known as the Mueller report. Now, before we get into what he said, let me address the fact that Bob Mueller felt, for whatever bizarre reason, to walk to the podium in the Department of Justice and announce, 1, I'm not going to take any questions, 2, I have a written statement, and 3, if Congress or, the Senate or the House, anybody wants to ask me questions, 1, I'm not going to answer any questions here, and if I am asked to answer questions elsewhere, I'm telling you now, my answers are the report. Let's talk about just that for a second. Congress has the ability, whether you like it or don't like it, whether you think it's legitimate or not legitimate, the Congress has the ability to subpoena anybody they want to. After I had left government and I was a private citizen, even though there were still hearings going on regarding Hurricane Katrina, and even though we had agreed, we had told the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee that we were more than willing to not only come and testify in a public hearing, but we were willing to come and testify in a deposition that was going to be led by the committee staff, by the committee lawyers. But even after all of those agreements, they still decided, and I'll never forget, I had finished testifying before I think it was the Senate Homeland Security Committee. We were walking down the hallway when I got a little tap on the shoulder, and I turned around, and there was some little twerp, some little staffer working for the House Homeland Security Committee that reached out, handed me a piece of paper, and said, "You've been served." And my lawyer, Andy, and I both looked at him like, you freaking got to be kidding me. We've already agreed to appear for the deposition, and we have agreed to appear before your hearing. So why do you feel what was it that made you feel compelled to issue a subpoena and have some little twerp deliver and serve me that subpoena when we've agreed to do that? I tell that story only because I want you to know that Congress has the right to subpoena anybody they want to, and that person, if they want to, just like any other subpoena that you might get in a civil or criminal matter, you can then, if you want to, you can contest the validity of that subpoena. You can move, in lawyers' terms, to have that subpoena quashed. In other words, have a court rule that the subpoena is not valid and that you don't have to testify. I really doubt that if the Senate or in this case, the House Judiciary Committee, headed by Jerry Nadler, the congressman from New York, that if they issued a subpoena to Bob Mueller to come and testify about his report, I seriously doubt that a court would quash that subpoena, and Bob Mueller would nonetheless, despite his protestations at this so-called news conference yesterday, although it really wasn't a news conference, because I think of a news conference where, you walk up and you make your opening statement, you present whatever statement you want to present, And then the gathered gaggle of the press then gets to ask you questions, and you can choose to answer the questions. You can give whatever talking points you want to give, and you can call an end to it whenever you want to, and you can exit stage left or stage right, and that's the end of the press conference. But that's not what Bob Mueller did yesterday. What Bob Mueller did yesterday was to walk to the podium and say, I'm going to read a statement, I will not take any questions, and I'm not going to testify before Congress. And then he gave a statement, which I found kind of interesting because he had obviously gone through the whole process of meticulously drafting up a statement, which you would have thought he would have read over and over and over, so that when it came time to read his statement in front of the gathered press, he would not have stumbled and bumbled over his words. He would have just been, boom, walked right into it, and said whatever needed to be said. But interestingly, he kind of stumbled and jumped all over the statement, and I thought he looked frazzled, unprepared, and almost as if this was, oh, Jiminy Christmas, maybe I should go give a statement. Somebody drafts something up really quickly, and I'll walk up to the podium and I'll read the statement in the press room of the Department of Justice. It was really bizarre. But I want to get into the meat of what he said, because I think if there were ever any doubts about the political intentions, whether it be of Bob Mueller specifically or of the special counsel's office generally, I think this press conference on Wednesday put everything to rest in terms of the questions of whether or not there were political motivations in this investigation. Because Bob Mueller made it abundantly clear during his statement that he had no interest in the equal application of the law. And in fact, when you listen to what he said, Bob Mueller upended the very basis, the most basic tenets of American jurisprudence, particularly criminal jurisprudence. And that is this: everyone in the United States of America starts out with a presumption of innocence. The most basic view of American justice, which has been affirmed and enforced by the United States Constitution, is that everybody in this country, citizens and non-citizens, and I make that point because this is a basic tenet of American law that applies to everybody on American soil. Everybody. Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Harvey Weinstein. You pick out the most vile individual that you know in your life. They are entitled to the presumption of innocence. The presumption of innocence is, in a nutshell, all of us are presumed innocent, absent conviction by a jury of a specific charge of criminal wrongdoing. In other words, the natural legal state of any individual in this country is innocence. We are innocent. And in a criminal case, we are innocent until the government, until the state, proves our guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That can be in front of a judge. It can be in front of a jury. Now, this standard of innocence, that we are all presumed innocent, it is not a state or a nature bestowed by cops or lawyers or prosecutors. It's not a state that is granted by anybody other than we have this basic tenet that says we are innocent until proven guilty. Innocence is not granted by unelected bureaucrats or federal prosecutors. Now, at one point in his remarks, Bob Mueller seemed to agree with that standard. that we are all innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Because he referred to the indictments against the Russian individuals and that Russian Internet Agency. I forget what it's called. In fact, I think that may be it, the Russian Internet Agency. When he referred to those indictments, where they were alleged to have hacked American servers during the 2016 election, Bob Mueller said specifically that the indictments, quote, contain allegations, and we, the special counsel, are not commenting on the guilt or innocence of any specific defendant. And then he went on to say this: every defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. Now, as I'm watching the press conference, I thought, yes, that's right. And if you stop right there and you say nothing else, I wouldn't be talking about this today. But he didn't. Instead, he came up with a new standard that is not that you are innocent until proven guilty, but it is almost the opposite. He said this. Listen closely to what he said.
The order appointing me special counsel authorized us to investigate actions that could obstruct the investigation. And we conducted that investigation, and we kept the office of the acting attorney general apprised of the progress of our work. And as set forth in the report, after that investigation, if we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. We did not, however, make a determination as to whether the president did commit a crime. The introduction to the Volume 2.
Let me go back to that. The order appointing the special counsel authorized us to investigate actions that could obstruct the investigation. So far, so good. That's factually correct. Part of the charging memo that he got from Rod Rosenstein was to see whether or not there was any obstruction of justice. Then he said this next sentence. We conducted that investigation and kept the office of the acting attorney general apprised of our work. Again, so far so good. Then he says this, and my head exploded. After that investigation, if we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. So let's take an inventory of what he said. He first talked about the Russians. And according to Mueller, the Russians are presumed innocent. Remember, he said, when he referred to the indictments of the Russians, that the indictments contain allegations and we are not commenting on the guilt or innocence of any specific defendant. Every defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. That's what he said about the Russians. But what he said about the president was this. After that investigation, if we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. So I guess according to Mueller, the Russians that have been charged, that have indictments against them, they're presumed innocent. But an American president is presumed guilty unless and until Mueller's team determines he's innocent. I want you to think about the standard that Bob Mueller just espoused when he said that. It is clearly, in my opinion, an obscene abomination against the rule of law. And that is in fact, as I watched more news after Mueller came out, there was prosecutor after prosecutor after prosecutor that the standard that Mueller had just announced truly was an obscene abomination against the rule of law, and one that would never be committed by independent attorneys who place a fidelity to their oaths and impartial enforcement of the law ahead of their political motivations. But amazingly, the contradictions and double standards didn't stop there. He went on to say, it would be unfair to potentially accuse somebody of a crime when there can be no court resolution of the actual charge. I mean, he said that after all but stating that Trump committed a crime for which Mueller never charged him. Just as Mueller's own words and actions at the press conference yesterday proved that he didn't want his team's report to speak for itself, the report itself proves that Mueller and his team don't believe it's unfair to accuse somebody of something that a court can't resolve. Because if they actually believe that, then the 240-page Volume 2 of their report on the obstruction investigation of the president would never have been authored. After all, because according to Mueller's own statement, such an operation would be patently unfair. And if it's unfair to air dirty laundry against a target who was never charged, surely it's even more unfair to do so in writing and then on camera during a press conference where you refuse to take questions or even allow anybody to ask anything where you might be able to explain yourself. You know, this kind of reminds me, just as Mueller did in his report and in the Wednesday press conference. I want you to think back to when James Comey flip-flopped about Hillary Clinton and the email server. Recall that it was James Comey himself who assumed powers that did not belong to him when he declared in that 2016 press conference that no reasonable prosecutor would charge Hillary Clinton with criminal wrongdoing in the mishandling of classified information and her use of this private email server to avoid public records. But just as Mueller did in his report, and just as Mueller did in that press conference yesterday, Comey followed up with his own statement that Hillary would not be charged with statement after statement after statement of all the awful things that Hillary Clinton did. He was not going to charge her. Well, that's not in his purview. James Comey had no right to do what he did to Hillary Clinton. I think it was wrong. It was a disservice to Hillary Clinton, and I'm no defender of Hillary Clinton. I think what Hillary Clinton did was a violation of the law. Other people have been prosecuted and convicted for precisely what Hillary Clinton did. But James Comey took it upon himself to say, well, here's all these things that she did wrong, but I'm not going to prosecute her. And I'm, in essence, going to say that I've made the determination that she's innocent. Now let's go to the Department of Justice guidelines, because the DOJ guidelines prohibit the actions of both Comey and Mueller when they stood up and shamed individuals who were never formally charged with any wrongdoing. And this is my point about, I can't tell you from a lawyer's point of view how frustrated I am about this. Because this is taking the innocence until proven guilty standard and not only inverting it, but they're turning it inside out. The Department of Justice guidelines say this: as a series of cases makes clear, there is ordinarily no legitimate governmental interest served by the government's public allegation of wrongdoing by an uncharged party, and this is true regardless of what criminal charges may be contemplated by the Assistant United States Attorney against third parties for the future. That's directly from the DOJ manual. But even worse, every bar association in this country has a rule governing every practicing attorney in the United States that also explicitly prohibits what Mueller did during that press conference yesterday. For example, Rule 3.8F of the American Bar Association's Rules of Professional Conduct states clearly. The prosecutor in a criminal case shall refrain. Shall, not should, not maybe. The prosecutor, Bob Mueller, in a criminal case shall refrain from making extrajudicial comments that have a substantial likelihood of heightening public condemnation of the accused. The reason for that rule is clearly stated by that standard that we are all presumed innocent unless and until we are convicted, duly convicted, in a criminal case, beyond a reasonable doubt, by either a court of competent jurisdiction or a jury in front of that court of competent jurisdiction. Mueller turned that upside down. Mueller said if we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. Now, I want you to take this down to a granular level. I want you to think about any prosecutor, any state prosecutor, any district attorney, in any district anywhere in the United States. They have a report on their desk. Law enforcement has developed an investigation about you. You have been investigated, maybe even without your knowledge, for the commission of a crime. And I don't care what the crime is. The crime is jaywalking. The crime is murder. The crime is rape. The crime is whatever you want it to be. Law enforcement develops their case. They present it to the prosecutor. The prosecutor looks at it and says, I don't know what you bozos were doing, but the case that you have presented to me against you, meaning you, is so weak, there's no evidence of any wrongdoing. There's no evidence of crime. Now, what would you expect the prosecutor to do at that point? Close the file, seal it up, and nobody ever knows the difference. Why is that? Because you are innocent until the prosecutor decides to take that case to trial and attempt to convict you beyond a reasonable doubt, with proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And if they're not willing to do that, the last thing you want the prosecutor to do in your case, and remember, I don't care what the crime is that you're being investigated for, can you imagine how pissed off you would be if the prosecutor, having looked at law enforcement's case file, looked at it and said, well, I don't see that there's enough evidence here to charge you with this crime, so I'm closing the file, end of story. Instead, I want you to imagine that the prosecutor did to you what Bob Mueller did to Donald Trump yesterday. Imagine the prosecutor who's looked at the case developed by law enforcement, alleging that you committed a crime, and the prosecutor has decided that there's not enough evidence, and there is certainly not enough evidence to even take it to trial, because the prosecutor is convinced that he cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed this crime. End of story, case closed. But instead, imagine the prosecutor standing up and saying, well, you know, if we had confidence that you clearly did not commit a crime, we would have publicly said that you didn't commit a crime. And in fact, I'm holding a press conference right now to say that we don't have evidence that you did not commit a crime, and so we're going to say that you didn't commit a crime, even though we investigated you for it, and we don't really know what to do with the file, but we investigated. It looks like you may or may not have committed a crime, but we don't have enough evidence to take it to a trial, so we're not going to say that you did not commit a crime. And if we thought that you did not commit a crime, why, we would say you did not commit a crime. You would have just had your name dragged through the mud for something that a prosecutor said we don't have evidence that you committed a crime, but in the public's eye, We're going to accuse you of committing a crime that we don't think we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and we're going to go in front of everybody in the world, everybody, God and everybody, and we're going to say, yeah, we don't think you clearly did not commit a crime, and we would have said so. Shame on Bob Mueller. Absolutely shame on him. You know, the other thing that bugs me about this whole thing that occurred yesterday is that Bob Mueller and his team refused to charge prominent Democrats for crimes that he charged against Republicans. Paul Manafort. You know, that name's kind of disappeared from the vernacular. We no longer really talk about Paul Manafort because nobody really cares anymore. Paul Manafort's been convicted of all of these charges of being an unregistered lobbyist for a foreign government, all of these paper crimes and all these financial crimes, and now he's off in prison somewhere to die. Bob Mueller charged Paul Manafort with the crime of being an unregistered lobbyist for a foreign government. Paul Manafort was a Republican, but Bob Mueller did not prosecute Democrat donor Tony Podesta or former White House counsel Greg Craig. Go back to Michael Flynn, George Papadopoulos. They were charged with making false statements to federal investigators. Well, what about Glenn Simpson, the Clinton campaign crony? What about Christopher Steele? They made false statements to both Congress and the FBI. Those were ignored. Nobody went after them. I am afraid, and some may say this is hyperbole, but I mean this with every ounce of my being. We're turning into a banana republic. We are criminalizing our political differences. We did that from the moment that Bob Mueller was appointed as special counsel. And now he has stepped in front of the microphone and yesterday turned the presumption of innocence on its head. What Bob Mueller did was not the action of a partial and independent investigator. What Bob Mueller did was more of a political operative. And if I haven't made myself abundantly clear, listen to Bob Mueller again.
The order appointing me special counsel authorized us to investigate actions that could obstruct the investigation. And we conducted that investigation, and we kept the office of the acting attorney general apprised of the progress of our work. And as set forth in the report, after that investigation, if we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so.
Unfreaking believable. The president, I don't care whether you despise Donald Trump with every fiber of your being, or I don't care whether you think that Donald Trump is the greatest president since, I don't know, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, I don't care, pick whatever your favorite president is. What Bob Mueller did yesterday to Donald Trump is un-American. It's un-American, and it goes against everything that this country stands for. You know, you may think that I'm absolutely off the rails today about the presumption of innocence. But the presumption of innocence is what separates us from every dictatorial, tyrannical government that's ever existed in world history. Because we believe that in a system of government where individual liberty is paramount, we believe that the government should not be able to either take away your liberty without substantive and due process of law, and in a criminal matter, doing so with proof that proves your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Because in tyrannical governments, it's just the opposite. In tyrannical, authoritarian, dictatorial governments, well, you're guilty unless you prove yourself innocent. Mueller. If we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. that could have come out of a courtroom in a banana republic like Cuba or Venezuela or Russia or China or any other place where they don't have the presumption of innocence. Don't be fooled by anything that you hear over the next several days about Mueller's statement. It was a bunch of bovine feces. Let me get a sip of Diet Coke here and let's keep moving on. I've deliberately not talked about the mass murder. I shouldn't say mass murder. I think there were 2 people that were murdered in Japan. There was a school girl, and then I think a parent of one of the girls was killed while they were waiting to either board a train or a bus to go to their school, somewhere between Osaka and Tokyo, I think. That's not the important part of the story. The important part of the story is that the person that attempted the mass murder did so with knives in both hands. And when I first heard of the story, I watched it because I was curious how the American press might cover it. I thought there might be, some passing reference to the fact that an individual intent on killing as many people as possible did so in a country with some of the strictest gun control laws in the entire world, and did so in a country where the culture itself is one of general nonviolence. And of course, American media and the foreign press, as best I could gather, reading as many different foreign news outlets as I could, ignored all of that. And the only point that was made by any news media was how awful it was that this individual tried to kill these school kids. What's the lesson for us? I think the lesson for us, and I don't know how I have sincerely tried to put myself in the shoes of those who are so anti-gun that they're irrational. Chris Cuomo, who is the brother of Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York. Chris Cuomo is the one that has the show on CNN. He tweeted out yesterday a video from NRA, National Rifle Association, NRA TV, in which a very pleasant-looking, I might even add, albeit attractive, and otherwise all-American woman, all-American mother, on NRA TV discussing how that if any dirtbag tried to break into her home to get to her children, would have to go through her firearm in order to get into the home and to get to her children or to get to her. Well produced, a very good point, and a legitimate point. Chris Cuomo retweeted that NRA video with a very simple statement, only in America. And so I retweeted his retweet, and I said, you know what, bucko? Only in America is correct. Only in America do we institutionalize our right of self-defense. Now, the Second Amendment, historically, is not really about you and I being able to defend ourselves against murderous thugs who might try to break into our home. The original intent of the Second Amendment was to enable you and I, as the militia, as the people that have the ultimate power in our system of government, to arm ourselves in the event that we have to defend ourselves from a tyrannical government. But in the Heller decision, and in the majority opinion so eloquently written by Justice Scalia, he took that Second Amendment that right of the people to keep and bear arms, which shall not be infringed, according to the Second Amendment, and said that that is an individual right, that you and I have that right to keep and bear arms, and we have that right because we recognize in this country that we have this God-given right of self-defense, this natural right of self-defense. And here's Chris Cuomo actually denigrating this woman for pointing out that if you want to try to harm her kids by breaking into their home in an attempt to harm the kids or rape her or burglarize them or do whatever else, you're going to have to come through her firearm to do so. And Chris Cuomo thinks that that's a horrible thing and says only in America. Now, how do I square that with what took place in Japan? Do you think there's anybody in Japan that has posted a video of any sort that says, what's wrong with us? You know, we need to outlaw knives. We've got to we need more government intervention to stop deranged, crazy people from doing deranged, crazy things? Not that I can find. So now we have two people murdered by knives in what was an obvious attempt at mass murder in Japan. And the American press just glosses over it like it's a non-story. And as opposed to being a non-story, I think it's an incredibly important story for every anti-gunner, every person who believes that you should not take it upon yourself to defend yourself, but instead you should rely upon law enforcement. I'm sure that in Japan, law enforcement responded because cops are everywhere and are ever present. I'm sure they responded as quickly and as effectively and as quickly as they could. Now, the knife-wielding murderer ended up killing himself. So think of the parallels. The parallels, you've got someone that goes to a school with a gun, with an attempt to kill as many people as possible. And just like this attempted mass murderer in Japan, when he no longer can achieve his objectives, decides that it's time to kill himself. And so takes a knife and slashes his own throat, killing himself. What are the anti-gunners in this country to take from that incident? I think a couple of things. First and foremost is this. Can we now accept that the gun is not the problem any more than the knives were the problem in Japan, or the acid is the problem in the United Kingdom, or the weapon anywhere is the problem? The problem is not the weapon. The problem are the deranged people intent on hurting others. We, throughout the history of mankind, have never been able to stop someone with the intent of harming someone else, of stopping that. And why we don't just recognize that people who have this deranged intent to harm others are going to find a way to do that. And the United States, God bless America, we've recognized that law enforcement is reactive. Law enforcement is after the fact. And in this country, we recognize that we have this God-given natural right to defend ourselves with whatever weapons we think are appropriate. A 9mm, a .357, a 44 mag, a 10 gauge, a knife, a baseball bat, a 9-iron, whatever it is that you want to use to defend yourself, you have the right to do that. They don't have that right in Japan. So what we ought to take away from Chris Cuomo's tweet when he says only in America in the most derisive way that he can is we should say, damn right, only in America. And let's recognize that based on what happened in Japan, that the weapon is not the issue. The issue is the deranged individual intent on harming someone else is going to find a way to do that. And fortunately, in this country, we have the individual right to keep and bear arms to defend ourselves from those people, those deranged individuals who are determined to inflict harm on you or your family. So yes, Chris Cuomo, I'll take the derision out of your tweet and I'll agree and I'll say, yep, only in America. Thank God, in America. You know, I've told you that I'm still in New Mexico at the undisclosed location. And actually, it's been fun being down here and being able to do the podcast. As I said earlier, the radio station had set up the home studio, and then they were setting up a studio at the home in New Mexico, and it worked out great. It worked out great for me because I'm now able to do the podcast both at home in Colorado and down here in New Mexico too. Speaking of Japan, there was no segue there, except I was going to mention that I understand from Tamara, who's back up in Colorado, that it's been cool and rainy, and I get some Colorado news down here, and they've been talking about how this is probably one of the coolest Mays that Colorado has seen in the past. I think I read somewhere or heard somewhere in the past 150 years. Well, here's a story about Japan, because Japan is going through just the opposite. They're going through a heat wave. And the headline is that a study finds, well, not the headline, but the lead-in paragraph. Study finds one of the clearest climate change signals to date in the record high temperatures in a result that surprised scientists. Deadly Japan heat wave essentially impossible without global warming. So I ran across this article, and a few Google searches later, I came across this study. The primary factors behind the heavy rain events and the subsequent heat wave in July from mid-July onward, this is from last year. And the story contains this graph. And as you can see, July 1978 was warmer than July 2018, according to the Japan Meteorological Agency. Now, here's the point that I think everybody glosses over. Atmospheric CO2 in 1978 was on the order of 334 parts per million. In July of 2018, atmospheric CO2 was about 80 parts per million higher. So, it begs the question, how can CO2 be blamed for the terrible heat in Japan back in July of last year when it was hotter in Japan in July of 1976 when the CO2 levels were actually lower? And then you think about and I don't judge me. Don't judge me. But one of the things that I do at the undisclosed location that I never do when I'm back home in Colorado is I tend to turn on the morning news shows. So I turned on the morning news shows, and of course they're talking about the outbreak of tornadoes that we've had this spring. And it's fascinating how they use statistics, because in this case, they talked about this is the greatest stretch of numbers of days where tornadoes have occurred than has occurred I think they said in the past 40 years. Meaning that 40 years ago, we did have this string of number of days with tornadoes. And then finally somebody came on, and this was the shocker to me. And I'm pretty sure this was on CBS This Morning. And on CBS This Morning, they were talking about the outbreak of tornadoes. And they turned to a meteorologist, and he's got one of these, fake television screens. He's got the green screen up. and it is, can the outbreak of tornadoes be blamed on climate change? And I thought, I have to admit, my confirmation bias set in, and I immediately thought to myself, here we go. This dipwad's going to blame the outbreak of tornadoes on climate change. But lo and behold, he didn't do that. And instead, he pointed out, 40 years ago, we had a string of tornadoes like this. It's springtime because we're having, and I'm like, holy cow, I can't believe he's saying this. Because we're having record cool weather and these record low high temperatures, west of the Mississippi, basically not really west of the Mississippi, but say from Chicago down through, say, the Oklahoma Panhandle, through the Texas Panhandle, down through, southeastern New Mexico. Everything west of that is having record low high temperatures, and everything east of that is having record high temperatures. And then he went on to explain how this confluence of cool, moist air hitting the dry, warm air is causing these dry lines to occur and for these outbreaks of tornadoes to occur. And then he said, that's weather. And said, so we really can't blame climate change. And I thought, holy crap, we are very near the end of civilization. Somebody on network television actually pointed out, it's springtime, we've got record heat east, we've got record cool west, and that's what creates tornadoes. And I thought, holy moly, pass the tequila. In one of the funniest stories that I've read, apparently the kind of dumbasses that support a snide old communist like Bernie Sanders, well, apparently they are poorly informed. Chuck Todd on Meet the Press this Sunday said this about Bernie supporters.
Developing here, Yamiche, in the Democratic primary polling. We've had a couple of recent polls, and there's one undeniable trend. Bernie Sanders seems to be getting squeezed from two sides. Joe Biden got in, his numbers grew. Bernie Sanders got lower, and Elizabeth Warren has been growing. And in some ways, Yamiche, what was interesting, I think it was in the Monmouth poll, the less you were paying attention, the more likely you were a Bernie Sanders supporter.
The less likely you're paying attention. In other words, maybe the dumber you are, the more likely you are to support Bernie Sanders. Todd said, as you just heard, the less you are paying attention, the more likely you are a Bernie Sanders supporter. Now, even a guy who was kicked out of a hippie commune for laziness may never have experienced a humiliation quite like losing ground to the shrieking faux Indian harridan Elizabeth Warren. But the implication, of course, is that Sanders voters are, and here we go again, it's election season, they must be low information. Clueless Bernie Sanders supporters, after they heard Chuck Todd say that, got on social media and expressed their outrage at having been called out. They actually accused NBC of being corporate and afraid of Bernie Sanders. They shouted that the mainstream media produces propaganda for the Democrat National Convention, which, well, let's just be honest, the networks do produce a lot of propaganda for the Democrats. But that's presumably continuing to conspire against Bernie, who is ostensibly the choice of the people. Some others went so far as to call the mere notion of information as being anti-Bernie Sanders conspiratorial action. Here's what they mean. So Anomaly tweeted, so the less you consume anti-Bernie propaganda, the more likely you are to support him. I hope someone got paid a lot of money to uncover that gem. One of the many things that Bernie bots don't get is that Sanders only barks leftist policy positions, but unlike Elizabeth Warren, is actually too lazy to apply them to concrete proposals. You got to say this about Elizabeth Warren. She's got a policy for everything. If someone says, I'm concerned about X, she has a campaign stump speech that starts out, well, I've got a policy for that. Maybe that's why she's ahead. Sanders is not really a candidate. He's just this petulant, childish gesture, the political equivalent of a small child throwing food on the floor from his high chair. But I love it. I love it when they get called out for being called low information voters. You've heard me. Hang on, get a sip of Diet Coke. Talking like this is kind of interesting doing the podcast, because talking for the hour, the podcasts are generally about an hour long, and normally on the radio you would only have about somewhere between probably about 18 minutes, because they were really cramming in a lot of commercial spots. So you would have about 18 minutes, then you'd have about 10 or 15 minutes of commercials. So that gave me plenty of time to go up and go to the bathroom and get have a sip of Diet Coke or whatever I was going to do. But doing the podcast, you don't really have the opportunity to do that. I mean, obviously I can stop recording and I can take a break and everything else. But if I'm on a roll like I am right now, I got to get a sip of Diet Coke in when I can. You've heard me talk about cultural Marxism. Well, cultural Marxism entails really a caste system that is based on a hierarchy of purely imaginary oppression. And within the hierarchy of cultural Marxism, there are these sub-hierarchies. I'll give you an example. People who are overweight regard themselves as oppressed and therefore deserving of the enhanced status enjoyed by other belligerently whimpering victims. But not all fat people, apparently, not all fat people are equally oppressed. So get ready for some real hardcore dumbassery. In a story that I read today, it goes like this. Smaller plus-size people, please check your privilege. So plus sizes, bigger. Can I say fat? If you are obese or fat or overweight or whatever, you fit into a hierarchy. I guess there's like the morbidly obese, and then there's the obese, and then there's just the slightly overweight. Or maybe we should just say fat. The story goes, smaller plus-size people, please check your privilege. That includes a mid-fat like me who is far more privileged than folks bigger than me. I'm honestly so sick of people including small fats and thinking that's enough. And I'm sick of small fats not calling out the fact that they are the biggest people at the event, shoot, meeting, or whatever it is. Fat people above a 20 exist, and we effing matter. We deserve to be included and seen. Super fat people deserve to be included. Infinity fat people deserve to be included. Fat people of color deserve to be included. Disabled fat people deserve to be included. We all matter too. Your body positivity isn't S word if it doesn't include us. Holy cow. I thought identity politics was out of control, but I never thought about identity politics in terms of morbidly obese and just fat people, but apparently this guy thinks so. Fat activists. Hey, Daddy, what did you do when you were growing up? And look, I can say this because I could stand to lose a few pounds. Don't tell Dr. Grossman, but I've put on a couple of pounds since I left the radio. Fat activists delineate the fat hierarchy with a taxonomy of 4 words. Now you've got to write down these 4 words and learn these 4 words, otherwise you're just not woke. Small fats, mid fats, super fats, and infinity fats. I guess like in infinity or something. Infinity, I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm a small fat. What are you? Small fat, mid fat, super fat, infinifats? Now, I think it's clear that in infinifat and infinifat, I can't pronounce it, infinifat deserves more favoritism than a small fat. But only an academic with a PhD in intersectional dumbassery could determine how this compares to the favoritism owed to other contestants in the oppression Olympics. Yeah, I think we should start an oppression Olympics. And instead of a gold, silver, and a bronze, maybe you get loser, super loser, loser, mid loser, and super loser. Say two people are competing for a job. A dark-skinned refugee from the Congo and a small fat. The refugee would get the job, right? But what if the choice is between a light-skinned mulatto and an infinifat? The decision could become so difficult as to force the HR department to consider secondary qualifications, something outrageous like aptitude or experience. So David Thompson, writing in this article, finds a clue while choking on the word privilege. In woke usage, the word privilege implies arbitrariness, some random quirk of life, an attribute or circumstance unrelated to one's own efforts or choices, as if becoming sufficiently vast to engage in fat activism and bang on about privilege were merely a matter of the planets aligning a certain way, as if anyone might become colossally fat spontaneously overnight with no warning and through no action or inaction of their own, which doesn't sound terribly plausible. In fact, it sounds like an attempt to displace responsibility and thereby deceive. Well, duh. All liberal ideology displaces responsibility, and all liberal ideology is an attempt to deceive. But this does suggest that the light-skinned mulatto should get the job rather than the infinifat without the employer having to resort to doing something radical like evaluating competence, since the mulatto was born mulatto and we're not really sure that the infinifat was born infinifat. Then again, if indulgers in sexual perversion can claim to have been born that way, why can't the morbidly obese claim to have been born that way? You see, this is what happens when you take identity politics and you put people in all these different verticals, all these different stovepipes. Pretty soon you have to work yourself into such a pretzel to try to placate every little identity politic vertical that exists that it just becomes insane. But let's be honest, obesity is truly a health issue. And it's dramatically exacerbated by the failure to treat it with diet and exercise. I actually kind of learned that. Dr. Grossman pounded it into my head. You're not going to lose weight unless you change your diet, unless you actually do some exercise. And man, and don't tell him I said this, but just changing the diet alone, I shed almost 15 pounds without doing anything. And I really only took up the exercise at his recommendation that it would make me feel better. And lo and behold, losing the weight and doing the exercise actually did make me feel better. But, progressives always have to progress. That's the nature of the beast. And it's not going to be easy to progress beyond what I mentioned yesterday or day before, and that's Gillette and their jumping the shark by now going after fat women to sell razors and now going after transgendered men to sell razors. Man, identity politics, it's a never-ending battle. If you can keep up with it, quite honestly, then you're probably doing a lot better than I am, because I'm not sure I can keep up with it. I casually mentioned yesterday about the EU elections that occurred in the European Union over the long Memorial Day weekend. Well, here's some surprising news. Despite a suffocating level of political correctness, a full 18% of Germans imagine that they live in a free country where they can express their views in public, according to a new poll just out. 59% of respondents out of the 1,283 people in the sample said they felt comfortable expressing themselves freely among friends. That's a pretty good number, right? Almost 60%. Almost 2/3 say they feel comfortable expressing themselves among friends. Well, wait a minute. 59%? Shouldn't that be 100%? The poll continues. But only 18%, less than 20, only 18% felt comfortable voicing their views in public. In addition, only 17% said they were comfortable expressing themselves freely on the internet, while a full 35% said that freedom of speech is only possible in private circles. Now, I think this poll implies that what Germans think and what you hear from them are very, very different. The touchiest subjects, according to this poll, are, unsurprisingly, Islam and refugees. Now, speaking of which, not everybody in Germany is afraid to speak his mind, even on controversial issues. A series of street interviews conducted by the same group, a series of street interviews with Muslims in Germany showed every single one of them asserting that it's absolutely and 100% a woman's fault if she is raped while wearing a short skirt. You see, free speech is not an issue in Muslim culture because everybody agrees with everybody else, or you get stoned to death. Here's the lesson to be learned from this poll. Political correctness is killing free speech in Germany. And mark my words, political correctness will kill free speech in this country. It's already doing it in public education, in institutions of higher learning, college campuses, and pretty soon in American society writ large. Mark my words. Let's get a couple of taxpayer relief shots in. This one fascinates me. This comes from the south side of Chicago. Chicago Popo fatally shot an armed man Tuesday while mistakenly executing an arrest warrant on the wrong person in South Chicago. Curtis Stagger, a brother of a man wanted in a May 14 murder in Roseland, allegedly pulled out a gun during the arrest, police and the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office said. Officers with the department's Fugitive Apprehension Unit attempted to arrest a 21-year-old about 1:45 in the afternoon in the driveway. Stagger pulled out a handgun while officers went to take him into custody while he sat in a vehicle. An officer then shot him. He was pronounced DRT, dead right there. You see, this is proof that thugs aren't the smartest people in the world. Yeah, you're getting arrested and you pull out a gun. Yeah, if they're there to arrest you or even your brother and you pull out a gun, you're going to get arrested. Wichita, our next taxpayer relief shot. A Wichita, Kansas man called a Popo to his home twice. Now, this one is bizarre, too. A Wichita, Kansas man called police to his home twice, claiming people were outside before they returned a third time early on Memorial Day and fatally shot him when he allegedly fired a gun at them. The Popo said Tuesday they were called to 49-year-old Robert Sabatar's home for the third time by a neighbor's report of shots being fired. Authorities said Sabatar ran out of his house and down the street, waving a gun and firing sporadically at the Popo. They said he refused an order to drop his weapon, and the officer shot him. He died at the scene. This guy had called the cops to his house at about 9 o'clock Sunday, again at 11, complaining that he had heard people outside. The cops, the first two times, said they found nobody. The third time, he goes running down the street, waving a gun, sporadically shooting at the cops. Suicide by cop? I don't know. Could be, couldn't be. But it goes back to the point in Japan. There's not much you can do when someone's deranged. They're either going to hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. Deranged is deranged. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for listening to the Michael Brown Unplugged podcast. So real quickly, go to iTunes, Search for Michael Brown Unplugged. You can subscribe on iTunes now, and I'd appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating, and if you have time, write a review, because that really helps, and I greatly appreciate it. And then last but not least, you can always go to michaelbrowntoday.com, michaelbrowntoday.com, and there you'll be able to find all the social media icons. So if you want to subscribe to YouTube, you want to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, all of that is on the website at michaelbrowntoday.com. Thanks for listening. Share the podcast with your friends and your enemies, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow.